everyone. Welcome to the Wellbeing in Higher Education podcast. This is Dr. Hande Güzel, and in collaboration with Cambridge Center for International Research, I'll be hosting this podcast on wellbeing in higher education. So this will span 6 episodes, where in each episode I will be interviewing an expert, a researcher on a different facet of wellbeing in higher education, and we'll be hearing their experience and their expertise on the topic. So today, for the first episode, I have an amazing speaker with me, Dr. Nicola Byrom. So first, I'm going to introduce her to you, and then we're going to start having our conversation and her insights on the topic. So Dr. Nicola Byrom is currently a senior lecturer in psychology at the Department of Psychology, Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology, and Neuroscience at King's College London. She earned her PhD in 2013 from the University of Oxford in the field of experimental psychology. Her research focuses on university student mental health. She's currently directing SMARTN, the UKRI-funded student mental health research network. Nicola also founded Student Minds in 2009 with the ambition to change the way we talk about mental health in higher education. Her work with Student Minds was recognized by the Queen, where she was one of the first people in the UK to be awarded the Queen's Young Leader Award. I could go on forever talking about her amazing success, but first of all, I want to say welcome, Nicola, and thanks so much for accepting my invitation.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's wonderful to be talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so what I want to first start with, and this is what you're going to talk about today, is at the heart of this podcast series. But I want to first learn a little bit about how you initially got involved in researching mental health in higher education.
Oh, right. So for me, this is the absolute dream, because I've always been interested in research, and I've always been interested in student mental health. And for quite a long track, my career seemed to be going in different directions. I'd spend all my spare time trying to do stuff around student mental health, and my research would focus a bit on sort of more, I guess more experimental approaches around mental health. And so I'm really fortunate that I've been able to bring the two together, and I've had the support of colleagues and senior management at King's College London to do that, who are really keen to try and see us do better research around student mental health. So it's wonderful to be able to do that. I started out, I guess, really with a passion around looking at student mental health from my own experiences. So I'd struggled with my mental health as a teenager. I think I was just really quite a socially anxious kid. I don't know if you'd label it as social anxiety, but I've always been a bit socially anxious, not very confident, a bit shy. And I think that sort of added up over time to more substantive mental health problems for me as a teenager. But I'd taken time out before I went to university. I had a gap year, and I'd made that really conscious decision that I needed that time to make sure I was in the right place to go to uni. And I think I was doing quite well when I moved to university. But uni is difficult, right? It's not easy, and it's because of the way we have universities set up in the UK. We go away from home, and that's the norm for many students. I know it's not for every student, and a lot of students study at home these days, and actually everyone does, given COVID at the moment. But it does seem sort of a rite of passage in the UK to make that shift, to move away from home, which isn't common in other countries. I don't think you could probably speak to this a bit more, but in Europe, I don't think that's a usual thing to do. In Australia, most kids stay at home, but that leap of moving away from home makes university, I think, a really challenging environment, because you're starting everything from scratch, and not only are you being asked to study in a different way, you don't have classes anymore, and you don't have a teacher. It's up to you to manage it, but you're also being asked to manage your life for the first time, and the expectations are huge. And I think also for students, you're on this you're in this limbo, aren't you? You've made this conscious decision that I want to keep studying because that will be good for my career, whatever my career is going to be. But you don't know what that career is going to be yet, do you? But I often felt jealous of friends of mine that were studying medicine, because I thought, well, at least you've got it worked out, right? You just finished the medical degree, and then, but I've worked out now it's not quite that simple. It's complicated for medics as well. But there's a huge sort of question mark over what are you going to do next? What's going to happen after the degree? And I think that question mark's there around your social life too. You're making new friends, you're losing old friends or moving away from old friends. And I think throughout my time at university, your friends and who your friends were felt really, really important. And it might just be that I'm getting old now, but I'm beginning to realize that a few friends here and there are really useful, but I don't need to be friends with everybody. But none of that felt. No, didn't have that perspective as a student. So anyway, I'm waffling here, and you wanted a concise answer probably, but I don't think university isn't easy, and I found it really, really tough. And I struggled through first year, and I struggled through second year. And as I actually went to see one of the university counsellors in second year, and I was chatting to her, and then I know the university counsellors can be really, really useful. But in talking to her, I was like, hang on, I've done all of this before. I've been in therapy. I've had help for my mental health problems. This isn't what I'm looking for. Actually, I'm looking for some kind of recognition and acknowledgement that university is just tough. It's not me, it's the environment I'm in. And I finally started talking to some of my peers and just being honest and going, I'm having a really rough time. I'm really not enjoying this. And what amazed me is that my peers stopped and turned around, and these people that I thought were really high functioning individuals that were doing really well at everything were saying, me too, Nicola, me too. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know where I'm going. I don't know. I just don't know what's going on most of the time. And this is difficult. And that has stuck with me since that moment of this thing. It's really easy just for us all to go around going, everything's perfect, everything's fine, we're all doing well. And we need to be maybe a bit more honest about the fact that things are difficult. And I think that problem's only accentuated since I've graduated, because I didn't have to deal with Instagram and the sort of the feeling of just sort of posting what everyone's doing, and you're always sharing the good bits of life. And so it becomes harder to see what's difficult. Anyway, I really am waffling now, but it's from I think the mental health research into student mental health is so important, because it's a difficult time in life. It's challenging. It doesn't get a lot of attention, and yet it is this huge transition point for young people to navigate. So yeah, that's how I got here and why I think it's important.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. And I think it's really, really important that you underlined how you were struggling yourself and you didn't have any idea that other people were struggling, because everyone is trying to put on that facade. And this is so much everywhere. And I think, we're going to talk about postgraduate experience as well. I think this is present for PhD students, even, different levels of academics, early career scholars especially, but at the same time, undergraduate students, where they, as you talked about, have this rite of passage, but they feel the need to look like they are managing every area of their lives, which is not possible. It's just not human, right?
Absolutely. And I think what's so interesting is, if you start more of those conversations, I think what I got to see was that if everyone else is struggling, then there isn't something abnormal about my struggle. There's not a problem. There's nothing wrong with me. It's that this is difficult. I'm doing the best I can in a difficult environment. And so maybe I don't need to be that worried about my mental health, because it's the environment I'm in, and I'm just doing the best I can. And actually taking some of that pressure off began to help me feel a bit more positive about everything, that it wasn't just that I was floundering. I could begin to see, I'm doing the best I can in this environment.
Yeah. So normalizing the fact that this is difficult and it's okay to
difficult.
struggle. Yeah, I think that's very, very important. So thinking of all of these, you then founded Smarten and Student Minds 2 initiatives. So could you talk a little bit about what these initiatives are and what do they do? Where do they stand in relation to the importance of student mental health that you mentioned?
Absolutely. And I'm realizing I've got my camera too high up for you to see that my arms are moving all over the place. But yeah, the Smarten and Student Minds, I was waving my hands as you were saying that, because very different time points for me. So Student Minds was something I was working on a decade ago, really. And I have to acknowledge that I've stepped back from it now. I'm not so involved in it. And I acknowledge that because the wonderful Rosie Tressler, who leads the charity today, has just done so much phenomenal work. And rightly deserves credit for what the charity is doing now. So yeah, hats off to her. She's a phenomenal individual. But my goal when I was starting up what's now Student Minds was to try and create more of a platform where students could take agency and say, we can do some of this ourselves. We can talk to each other. We can be here to support each other. We can be more positive about mental health and about recovery from mental health problems. When I was first starting out with Student Minds, that was a big bit of what I was interested in, was trying to share stories around positivity and hope that says we can recover from difficult problems. So a lot of the early work around Student Minds was focused around eating disorders, where that story of recovery is so important, because sometimes it can be really easy to lose hope and just to say, this is me, this is my life, I'm never going to shake this beast of a disorder off. But sharing those stories of recovery can be valuable. So I think at the core of what we were trying to do at what I was trying to do at Student Minds was bring students together to work together to say, I guess it's really to say together we can change things. If we work together, we can support each other. We can argue for changes in university policy and practice. I have to say, actually, that phrase is mine now. I don't think I was using that at the time. And to try and basically lift up that student voice, to say we're not just recipients of support and services, we should have a voice in designing and delivering them. And that's what I was trying to do, Student Minds, and what the charity is now doing so successfully. I mean, it's absolutely phenomenal that that's where we started, and today the team at Student Minds, fantastic Lee Spanner and her colleagues there, have put together the University Mental Health Charter and are setting out a framework for what universities should be doing around student mental health. So if I'd known back when I set it up that our small band of students together could get one day to a place where we're telling university senior management, this is what you need to do, and they're listening, that's a big move. And Smarten's been my focus much more recently. So as I was saying, when we started, when I moved to King's, I'm just so privileged that they saw in me that combination of a psychologist and someone really passionate about student mental health, and they've given me the space and the opportunity to try and bring those two things together. And UKRI have put together this funding that's allowing us to try and build research networks. So that's to try and bring people together with a common and shared interest around student mental health to improve the quality and of research in this area. I think it's been historically an understudied area, and to me that's really worrying, because it leaves a sort of an evidence vacuum. So universities are they can see and they can recognize there's a problem around student mental health, and they're trying to respond to it, but we can't tell them what would be the best thing to do. We can't even really tell them which students are most vulnerable for mental health problems, or what approaches are most important. And I think as researchers, we really have an obligation to focus on student mental health a bit more, to try and fill this evidence gap, to help universities identify where they want to be focusing their resources.
Yeah. And that's what Smarten is actually the
that
gap.
Is what we're trying to do at Smarten. And a lot of my energy at Smarten is trying to bring early career researchers together to help them collaborate and build I guess, start to build towards a career in this space. Because I think if we can keep early career researchers focusing on student mental health and help them develop and bring in more skills, that would be useful. That will be useful in the long run. But it's not going to be that's not a quick turnaround. It's going to take time. But I think it's time that's worth investing.
Absolutely. And it's amazing that you're both filling that research gap, evidence gap, and then at the same time doing this, student minds that you have started, that is doing the action part, that is actually helping people out. And as far as I know, and correct me if I'm wrong, Student Minds is active in a variety of different universities in the UK, collaborating with them with their own little branches of Student Minds, right?
So this is gonna show me how out of touch I am, because I can't tell you exactly how many university Student Minds are in, but they work at a range of levels. So they have student groups in universities. And in that respect, they're then very focused on the ground at grassroots in a number of universities. But they also then work with students' unions. So loads and loads of students' unions have worked with Student Minds, so that what Student Minds is doing there is, rather than delivering the program or delivering an intervention for students, they're upskilling the students' union team so that they can deliver them. So it becomes embedded within the university's existing structure, or the students' union existing structure. They do work with various different staff groups at universities, again trying to embed their kind of approaches within universities. So a lot of, I guess we'd label them train the trainer type models, which is I think a really efficient, sensible way of working, because you embed skills, knowledge and confidence within the services that already exist, or the structures that already exist within universities, rather than trying to sort of replicate the wheel. Effectively.
And sorry. Yeah.
No, that was me done. I was just waffling at the end.
Oh, that's perfectly fine. And it becomes sustainable, like, in this system, I guess, which is the thing that we need the most in student mental health.
I think that's a particular strength of Rosie Tressa's approach, is she's always trying to look at what the most sustainable way of building change is. So how do we build change that means that you put in the effort now, and it's gonna pay off for years to come, rather than just needing her energy all the time. So hats off to her for that approach.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let's dive in a little bit about student mental health. And what I would like to ask you is, we talk about mental health, the well-being and mental health of different groups of people. So you talked a little bit about that rite of passage and how that makes it different for students and more difficult. But are there other ways that students' mental health challenges are different from other people, and why and how are they different?
So there are a few things I think that are worth looking at here. So we know that mental health, that there are real mental health challenges for young people, and we've seen some really worrying rises in the prevalence of mental health problems amongst young women in particular. So I think we need to think about university students within that age context. They're at a difficult period of high risk for mental health problems and of life transition, that you think things are changing in your life, and managing that change is challenging. So I think in that respect, they're different to other sections of the population. But I also think we need to keep thinking about the scale of that transition. So we know that I guess think about a few sort of factors that are problematic for mental health is uncertainty, not knowing what's happening. I mean, COVID has brought this to light for everyone to such an extent, hasn't it? If there's just continual uncertainty, it's really taxing. But a lot of a university student's life is in that kind of limbo of uncertainty. They don't know what's happening next. And I think that's a real challenge of not knowing where you're going and what you're going to do. and sort of asking students to sit with that and say it's okay. I'm okay with that uncertainty. I also think that there's a lot around university life, around expectations that are difficult to manage. So just one example is that I think many students experience a mismatch between this almost a sales pitch that university is going to be the best time of your life and you're going to make all of your best friends at university. And I think that sales pitch is one that's repeated in the media, and it's repeated by universities as well. And I think that's challenging, because if that then doesn't, if your experience doesn't live up to that, then you have this mismatch between your expectation and experience. And so at one level that could lead you just to feeling a bit disappointed, but I think it's worse than that. Is it leads you to wonder, what am I doing wrong, because I'm not having the best time of my life, and I don't have the best friends, or I don't feel I'm in the most supportive friendship groups. And I think that is a challenge to be tackled. And then, so I guess I'm thinking there are things that are difficult for all students. Finances are difficult for most students. That you're walking this ground, aren't you, where if you have a loan, you're living within that budget. Many students feel they need a job alongside that, but every hour you put into your job, you're taking away from time that you could spend studying. And so that there are these conflicting priorities that are new for students to deal with, or new for many students to deal with. But there's things for everybody. I think there's some more specific things that I guess still really frustrate me, that they're still a problem. So in terms of service provision, now you might say, why should we treat students any different to anyone else? But if it's often standard to have to wait 4, 6, 9 months to access support through the NHS for psychological treatment, that is a huge chunk of the student's university year. And many students, if they're hitting a point of crisis and they're getting to the NHS services at that point, they cannot wait that amount of time. It's not like you can just put your life on pause because they're falling behind on their studies. And actually, for many, that means that they end up dropping out of their studies because they can't press that pause button. And then a more challenging specific issue for students in terms of accessing support is we still have issues where registering with 2 GPs seems to be problematic. So we've done phenomenal, I will say that we've done phenomenal work, I guess as a whole society, and the universities and their widening participation programs, bringing more students into universities and bringing students from a wider background into universities. And it's fantastic that students with substantive lived experience of mental health problems are able to access university education, and that seems like a logical and a sensible thing for young people. But I don't think we're there yet in making sure that the university and the National Health Service speak to each other effectively in helping them make that transition into university. Because if they move away from home, there is still an inevitable gap as the service provision catches up with them, which, if I'm honest, is just still, I think it's just unacceptable. It's not okay that we're leaving young people in this limbo without support, because it means that to that really difficult time where they're making this huge transition, they don't have support that they might have previously had. So that's a more specific aspect. But sorry, I could waffle at you all day, I think, on this. There's so many aspects about the university experience that are different, that create new challenges. But I think those are some of the biggest.
Yeah, thank you so much for these. And I think you've covered a lot of common points across different groups of people. And obviously other people are going to have their own personal challenges depending on their, family relations or their own background. But I do want to go back to what you said about this service provision and being able to access support. So can we think of ways that universities can be more supportive, and other subgroups within universities?
So this
How
is
do you think? Yeah.
No, I was just going to say, this is it. It's interesting that you then pick up on the universities bit, because actually the kind of situation I'm thinking about, I think falls outside of the university scope. So young people that are coming to university with substantive long-term mental health problems, they've been supported within the NHS. That support shouldn't shift. It shouldn't become the university's responsibility to provide that support when they move. The NHS should keep providing that support. And I think it's often actually within the NHS that's falling apart, because our National Health Service isn't actually designed very well to be national. If you move, it's difficult. And so I think there's work that universities could do in linking up with the NHS better, and coordinating, but that's not it. That kind of joint working can't be done in isolation. It can't just be the universities that are doing it. It requires the health services to do that too. So there's ground to be moved in both ways. But I don't know if you had Hande, if you had a broader question. I've gone quite specific in that answer, and I know I cut you off before you finished asking.
No, that's perfectly fine. I think that's really important to see, the role of NHS, and not, expecting the universities to do all of the job. And I think that speaks more to students who do have a mental health background. And then maybe we can think also about people who do develop these mental health issues like anxiety, or anything related to loneliness, all the challenges that we've been talking about. So what about the institutional role when that happens, when the universe being in the university context is the reason why students are struggling?
Fab. Okay. I'm going to rephrase your question, if I might. I think if universities are addressing that, they need to address it before the problem arises. So they're actually not all that bad at the moment at responding when there is a problem. When a student puts their hand up and says, I'm really struggling with that, there's lots of support around in our universities. But as one wonderful student put it, in a panel discussion I was in last week, she said, I've come from a school that didn't have a lot of support around mental health, into this university, and there seems to be loads going on, but I don't really know what all these services are, and so I'm not sure which service I should go to and how I should approach the service, and what do they do anyway, and so what problem do I have, and where do I go, and why do I go to them? And I think that, I mean, she put it very eloquently, but I think that question is shared by many students, that it's not easy in the first place to put your hand up and say, I'm struggling, I'm different, I'm not coping. My peers all seem to be, but I'm not. I mean, it takes an awful lot of guts and courage to do that. Or if I rephrase it, it takes you having to really have hit rock bottom to say that. And we know that all psychological interventions are better if we intervene early. If we do something before somebody hits that point where it's really, really bad. And then they've put their hand up, and then they have to start thinking about, well, how do I navigate this support structure? Where am I going? What am I doing? Who am I going to go and see and speak to? And that can be overwhelming and difficult. I mean, it's not, it can be, I think it is. So sorry, I'm waffling at you a lot. I would really, really love to see universities putting more effort and energy into thinking about all of their students before anyone needs to put their hand up and say, I'm struggling, because the basic line is that they won't, and they don't, and there's a huge mismatch. So services across our universities have been seeing year-on-year increases in the number of students asking for help, and to me, in many respects, that's great. That's absolutely fantastic, because it says our students are coming forward and they're saying, please help. But there's also concerns that many students that are struggling aren't accessing the services, and there's a mismatch between those that really need the services and those that are accessing the services. So we need to think about, how do we take that support and wrap it around students so they don't have to feel like they're putting their hands up, and they don't have to hunt it out. And I think there are some really simple things. Sorry, I shouldn't say that, really simple things. If they were really simple, they'd have been done by now. But I think universities need to do more to think about the education environment that students are in, and to see that as a space where they build friendships and they make relationships with each other. So what can we do? What can every academic department do to create the space where students meet each other and feel like they can connect with other peers? So at some level, that's going to be about building group work and collaborative projects into your first year and your first semester, so that students right from the beginning are being told, these are your peers, work together, you're going to get to know each other, you're not always working on your own and in isolation. And there's some really interesting work starting up looking at sort of differences between collaborative and competitive curriculum, and thinking about, can we change that mindset so we get students working together a bit more. I think there are some simple things that are actually seem to be fiendishly complicated in universities around space. So creating space that's there for students and specific groups for students is really valuable. If when we ever get back onto campus, it's helpful for students to have a space that's theirs and that they can congregate in. Otherwise, how do they meet each other? They're like ships passing in the night. They come into campus and they go off again. And where is it that they're going to bump into each other and have some time to chat? And if that space is there for smaller and defined groups of students, well, that makes it easier for them to get to know their cohort, because they know why their other students are there. Where do I go now? I could go so many different directions. We could have more honest conversations with students about the social experience and the expectations at university, and try and set those expectations more fairly, I think. But I've been talking mostly there about oh no, let me do one more university point if I might. I love us in universities, and this might be my own little bugbear, but to have more teaching capacity, to be able to support students from an academic perspective. And you might be going, what has that got to do with their mental health? You're now talking about education and that educational priority. But if we can work with students early in their degree to help them feel confident in their own academic ability, you cut out loads of the uncertainty, the concern about perfectionism, that sort of build up into much bigger problems. And really what they need is just at the start, early on in their degree, to be told, you're doing okay. And if you're not doing okay, these are the little steps that you need to make. And that kind of approach requires capacity to work with students on something close to a one-to-one basis. But where I was going is that so everything I've said there is about the university. We need to also think about what's going on around the students. So Student Minds have done some really interesting work with accommodation providers recently, and I think that's really important to think about where students are living, what the environment's like where they're living. I'm just going to throw out a rather bold and controversial statement, but I think as we've improved the quality of student accommodation, we might have also made it less friendly and sociable, because it's much easier now to lock your door and live in a single room flat. So it's really helpful where universities can create communal spaces in the living environment so students can meet each other. Anyway, sorry, I can go on, so I'll pause and let you get a word in there.
No, thank you so much for all of these different ways that actually maybe even students listening to this can realize that it's, they can actually feel confident with what they have been doing so far, for instance, or what are the ways that spaces that they can create to be with their peers. But what I was wondering as you were speaking is, you were talking about lack of spaces where they can actually come together, lack of collaboration. And then now we have the pandemic, which is, making everything much more difficult. Space is now just defined virtually. And there are ways of course, having a Zoom party or having a study buddy through your, again, camera. And obviously that doesn't take the place of in-person collaboration or conversations, and that's not news. But can we talk a little bit about the impact of the pandemic on student mental health? And then from there, maybe we can move on to what are some ways that we can actually work within the environment that we're in right now?
Absolutely. I'm a little worried about focusing in on the impact on student mental health per se, because that, I think, makes it feel and look like there's a particular problem with student mental health. There's a problem with everyone's mental health, right? We've seen huge rises in young people at school, their challenges. And I think it's simmering below the surface for many people. And I only point that out not because I want to undermine what's been going on for students, but to say that it's helpful for them as well to see that in context. They're not alone in this struggle. We are all in this together, and it's really difficult. Some of the most moving conversations I've had with students over the last year is where they're tearing their hair out over things, and I've been able to say, do you know what, I'm going through the same kind of stuff here, and that's that sort of humanity, bringing that connection, helps us bring that connection with each other. But we can't overlook the fact that their university experience has been really disrupted, and it's, I think, particularly hard for the first years that have come in. It's really difficult to make new friends online. It's just about possible, I think, to sustain relationships online and to sustain collaborative working online. But starting from scratch, meeting new people is really difficult. So I think I've got a really overly simplistic answer for this, but we just all need to keep everything fingers and toes crossed that in the autumn term we get the students back onto campus and they get a chance to meet each other and spend time with each other. But in saying that, I think the pandemic has taught us all an awful lot about things that we could do better in teaching our students. So some research that I did, it's rapidly becoming last year now, but sort of last summer, looking at the experience of our students at King's in terms of moving online. And surprisingly, I guess we were surprised at how many students liked the shift in the teaching experience. So some things that were positives for them is, well, these pre-recorded lectures, if they were pre-recorded carefully, they're sort of hitting, they're easier to digest pedagogically. So we're giving students bite-sized amounts, and that's helpful. But at a more superficial level, students are also saying it's great that I can press pause and I can rewind and I can come back, and that's really helpful for my studies. That's useful. I used to come into lectures and I'd sit there and I wouldn't really know what was going on for the hour, and then I'd go home again, and so I'm not sure why I was doing that. So that to me is really interesting. And King's is also then in the middle of London, and we have lots of students commuting, and thinking about the space and the time they spend with each other. They might have had timetables where they were coming in for a 1 hour lecture and that was all they had on campus that day. And if they've got a 1 hour commute, I can really see why you wouldn't want to do that. So I'm really keen to get our students back onto campus to see each other, but I'm not putting my lectures back in lecture theatres again. I don't think ever. I've got no interest in doing that, because I think it serves the students much better to have them recorded and they can watch at home. What is the point of them sitting in a dark room quietly while I talk at them for 2 hours? Why would we do that? But I do think we can think again about saying, well, maybe what we do is we put all their seminars on a single day, and you come into campus and you have one busy day where you get to chat to everyone and you catch up and you can share notes and you can work together. But we make that a really fulfilling day where you come into university, and then you can structure your own time as you please around that.
Yeah, so this is actually moving on to maybe a more hybrid version of teaching and learning. But I also like that you underlined the benefits from online learning, because we tend to look at the negatives. But I do agree with you, because I've had students, especially with, if it's a more theoretical lecture, they do get a lot of benefit from pausing, replaying, or if they have special learning difficulties, having those captions, I think, makes a very big difference for a lot of students. So we've been talking about the pandemic and its impact on mental health and on everybody's mental health. But something that I see a lot is now there's more talk about mental health in general, and student mental health more specifically. And what I have been asked, and what I have been asking myself as well, is, has it actually become more frequent, or has it become more visible? So were people struggling for years and we weren't actually talking about it? Or um, what happened there? What made the leap possible to either make it more visible or make it more audible? Or was it actually, do we have a very big rise right now? So what is happening there?
Hande, I'm not enough of an epidemiologist to be able to answer that. In fact, I'm not an epidemiologist at all. I can tell you that I'd be surprised if we have a clear, comprehensive answer to that, because I don't think we have good data about student mental health before the pandemic.
Yeah.
I think there are a few universities that have got data that they can track through. I'm not sure about the scale of them. So how large their samples are to be able to say things with confidence. But I'm looking forward to seeing some of that research being published. I think that would be interesting to see. So I'm going with speculation here. So I think it's worth remembering that we had some really substantive problems around student mental health before the pandemic. So whatever's happened, even if we're seeing big increases in the problems during the pandemic, I'm fairly confident that the pandemic ending is not going to fix the underlying problems that we have around student mental health. One of my particular bugbears is this focus on loneliness and how lonely everybody's feeling. And I really appreciate how lonely this pandemic has been. I'm dying to catch up with some friends and actually see some people. And I have a toddler at home, and so having a phone call with somebody is not the easiest thing to do ever, because mummy, 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 mummy. But but I don't think just getting students back onto campus will fix the loneliness problem, as we've been saying already. Like that there have been issues. There have been issues before the pandemic. That covered, I really appreciate that there've been some big things that have changed that have made life for students a lot more difficult. So there's an awful lot more financial uncertainty for our university students. And that financial uncertainty we know contributes to mental health problems. So I think there's some very real, very concrete problems that students are facing that are likely to be adding to mental distress. But I want to just pick up on something that you're saying there around whether these mental health problems are more visible. Some of the colleagues I work with, and I'm beginning to have more and more sympathy for this, are slightly concerned that we are overplaying the mental health challenge around COVID, because it feels like a card that can be played. It feels like this is one way of saying the situation that we're in is intolerable. It's impacting on our mental health. But I think it's quite important that we feel that we're able to say this situation is intolerable, full stop, not and it's intolerable but because it's impacting on our mental health. I don't know if that point makes any sense, but it sometimes feels like mental health is being brought into the discussion because it's a bargaining chip that people understand. Whereas I don't know. I could go.
Yeah, I think if I'm understanding correctly, you're talking about actually the other existing structural inequalities, for instance, or the problems that are already there.
Yep.
And if we just talk about mental health, we're actually ignoring whatever else there is.
Ignore and we can overlook some of the underlying problems. Absolutely. And it's okay also just to say that our experience through COVID has been horrific and horrible, without having to say that it's had an impact on our, like it might have had an impact on our mental health, but just that it's been horrific and horrible should be enough. That's enough as well. Yeah.
Great. I mean, great as in not the topic is
not great
not the impact, but great insights. So moving from there, we did talk about what the NHS could do or could have done, or what institutions can do. I also want to ask, obviously not putting it all on students to resolve their own mental health struggles, but we also talk about them being agents in their own recovery. So what can they do? Obviously, there are dozens of resources out there on the internet, but what are some ways that you can recommend someone listening or watching they could pick up and do to improve their mental health, even in the slightest bit?
I'm really pleased you're asking that, because before I get into a concrete answer, it remains I guess a challenge for me, is that I'm constantly talking about this whole university approach and saying that universities need to think about the environment they're creating for students, and we need to think about what accommodation providers are doing. We need to think about the environment that we're building for students. And I really run a risk in doing that I make students feel like they're passive in this situation, that all they can do is say, hey, my university's not doing enough for me, this isn't okay. And I worry about that, because if you don't believe that you have agency in your own life, that's a recipe for a mental health crisis. If you feel that you are helpless, that you can't control the environment around you, that's really problematic. And so I don't think I always articulate this well, but I've always passionately believed that we need to do both, that we need to think about what universities can do for the environment that students are in, but also what students can do for themselves, and to remind all students that there are things that you can do. You're not just I guess a leaf on a tide that's being pushed around by the forces around you. Yes, they might have an effect, but you have control. You have a degree of control. And if I rewind back in my own experience, that is really what I was trying to do with Student Minds, was to say, actually, as students, we can come together and we can do something. We can support each other. So one of the places I'd start in thinking about this is, I often end up finding myself chatting to colleagues about saying we need to change the university culture. We end up going, we need to change this culture. Now, this might be because that I don't have enough skills and expertise in anthropology and in culture and societies, but this often comes back to feeling very problematic, because you're left with the question, go, well, what is our culture? Where does the culture come from? Who builds the culture? How does it exist? Who's responsible for changing it? And we can get into discussions often also with the university leadership. Who is in charge of mental health at universities, and who's fixing it? And I think the answer is, for both of those, that it's everybody's responsibility. The culture that we're in at our universities is built out of every individual's little actions. We all have a part to play in that. It's certainly what I remind myself when I'm feeling really angry at how I'm being treated by other people, and just going, you know what, I can get really angry, or I can go, this anger won't help the academic culture that we're working in. I need to think about how I'm supportive to others. And so what I'm building up to there, in terms of telling students, what can you do to improve the immediate environment that you're in? What steps can you take? My sister's often reminding me, and this is probably going to seem very unscientific, but I find it the most helpful thing, is to stop and in a day ask, what one thing have you done to make someone else's day better? And that's what matters. Doing things for other people makes us feel good, but it also makes them feel good. And it is a little tiny step to building a more supportive and caring, compassionate culture in our universities. And I'm hearing, as I'm saying this, the student shouting at me saying, but I am just this tiny piece in this huge system. What do you want me to do about it? And I know. But what is that saying? If a small group of people can't change the world, well, that's all that ever has. It's all that's ever worked, is a small collection of people, dedicated individuals, caring and wanting to make something different. I also hear the argument that I'm saying, well, the people that are struggling the most need to find the energy to dig in, and that's hard, and they can't keep fighting a battle day in, day out. And I hear that, and I understand that our universities are not always the supportive environments that everyone needs them to be, and that they sometimes students feel that they're packed full of microaggressions, racially orientated or sexually orientated, and that is challenging. And I don't want to undermine that, and I don't want to say that that's not real and that has to change at a large scale. But we can get angry about it and upset about it, or we can also stop and say, how do I make myself feel better in this situation? And I've always found that the best way to make yourself feel better is to stop and think about, well, what can I do for those around me? How can I make their lives just a little bit better? It shifts your focus from you, and it thinks about, well, how do we start making this whole environment a bit better? Sorry, long waffle, but I should add on to that, Hande is absolutely right that there are loads of resources out there. So my answer and suggestion is not helpful for starting CBT or accessing some kind of therapy, and all of those are sensible things to do. I was thinking about, in the whole, what are the little things we can do for each other?
Yeah, I think that's beautiful, and that's, looking at that ripple effect and knowing that, I guess what you're talking about is not doing this one major thing that's going to help. But I remember, for instance, when I first moved to the UK for my PhD, when I was trying to get to my accommodation, there was a student who helped carry my luggage. And that's an experience that I will never forget. And that started off my whole experience in Cambridge in such a great way, such a positive way, that I am also trying to pass on to other people. So it's just those little things that make someone happy, and then creating that ripple effect in yourself and other people, by being maybe just kind, or saying just a kind word, even that.
That's exactly what I'm getting at. It doesn't have to be earth-shattering, but to you, that experience was earth-shattering, wasn't it? It changed so much for you. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. What I finally want to talk about, and I know this is a big topic, and we may not have time to dig into like a lot of specifics about it, but we've been mostly talking about students in general, but undergraduate students. And then there's this whole postgraduate experience, master's, and then PhD. So again, I know it's a big topic, but what are some ways it's different to be a postgraduate student? And what are some mental health challenges that these people face differently than undergraduate students?
Hande, you could have me back for another whole hour answering that question.
Happily.
I'm not going to do it justice quickly. If I focus in on PhD students in particular, I think some of the challenges they face are, from the one hand, universities still focusing predominantly on their undergraduate students. So often the PhD students feel like an afterthought. They're sort of an add-on to services. So they might not feel like the university support structures are geared towards them. They're just sort of, they can make use of them, but they're not designed for them. I think we have a fundamental systemic problem about whether PhD students are staff or students. I don't have, well, I do have the answer to this, but I'm pretty sure that it's not workable. But I'm not sure what the justification is for not making them staff and treating them as staff. Because I think we're putting them in a really difficult position where we're expecting them. We have expectations of them in line with staff, but don't honour that in employment contracts, job security, and pay, holiday pay, sick pay, and all of this then gets unnecessarily complicated for them. But I'm sure I'm then treading on some very, very big institutional toes around that. But just my feeling from talking to PhD students around sort of some of the systemic challenges around mental health. I think in many universities, PhD students are still working in silos, and it's quite hard to build bridges and relationships between them. So the PhD is inherently a lonely experience, or risks being a lonely experience, because it's you and it's your piece of work. I don't know about your experience, Hande, but mine certainly. I frequently had moments where I was like, am I literally the only person on the planet that cares about this? And possibly you are for areas of a PhD, because that's what you're being encouraged to do. Dig into it, become the absolute expert in this. But that's a really lonely place to be going, I care about this more than anyone else in the world. And then sometimes I'm not sure anyone else cares about it either. So why do I care about it? Anyway, I'm waffling. I'd really love us to keep concentrating on how we build better links between PhD students and a better PhD community. And you and I have both been exceptionally privileged in that we did our PhDs in a collegiate university, where that college structure creates that sense of community, which I think demonstrates to other universities that it can be done. You can build a community around your PhD students. It's possible. It might require a bit more ingenuity and creativity, but I think the PhD experience is always going to be problematic if it depends on one student coming in and working with one or two academics in a department, and that is their engagement with the university. That's a really tough place to be.
It is. And on top of that, the sort of things that we address with undergraduate students, I hear that you're seeing them for PhD students as well, in terms of uncertainty, because we talk about job insecurities and loneliness, even though they're manifested in different ways, because you're not lonely in undergraduate education while you're taking the course, maybe, but you experience loneliness in different ways, whereas the whole PhD, the entire PhD experience can be actually.
Well, you're picking up there, Hande, is that there's a separation between social isolation and loneliness. And loneliness is a psychological construct. It's our interpretation of a mismatch between the social engagement we expect ourselves to have and the social engagement we actually have. So people can be in complete isolation and not feel lonely because they don't expect social contact and they don't want it. But I think that's perhaps the difference that we see for undergraduate students. They're really lonely in big crowds of people.
Yeah.
It's hard to connect. And I think we're for PhD students, we've almost designed an experience that forces them into social isolation and makes it really hard to connect with other people.
Yeah, so then it becomes something that they haven't chosen for themselves, social isolation. And I think in my experience, I managed to create some networks around research interests that are common with other people, which then overcame that loneliness that forced isolation would bring about. But it's also not possible for everyone. They might not have people. Obviously, it's different for natural sciences versus social sciences, but especially in social sciences, it's not always possible to find people that you have common interests with and build those communities, I guess.
Absolutely. I think your point around common interest is interesting, because I don't know if the PhD communities that we need to build need to be focused on common academic interest. There are, dare I say this to another academic, but there are other elements of our lives, right? That there's sometimes other stuff going on other than the academic inquiry that we're engaging with, and so building a more general community that allows students with different interests and different expertise, different focus to come together, but just creating that space that's theirs, creating that opportunity to meet other students and spend time together or collaborate, I think would be valuable.
I think, yeah. I think in my experience, the other one was already present, and that's the one I was yearning for, and that's the one I tried to build. But it's really important to underline that, yeah. For a lot of researchers, especially when you're doing a PhD, it might look like that's what the world is of your academic environment, of your own research interests, of your own little bubble. But there is life outside of that as well.
I'll just add on to that, because you were asking earlier what students can do, and
yeah.
I wish we did more preparing students thinking about doing a PhD, and there are two massive things that are the huge bugbears for me, which is one is students that are self-funding, and I don't think we should say you shouldn't and you mustn't, but that is a huge deal to enter into, that commitment that you're going to fund this yourself. I think if students are self-funding, universities need to do an awful lot more to make sure that they're in the right place to do that in the first place, and that they're going to get a positive and a supportive experience if they're making that commitment. Because I think what often goes hand in hand with that self-funding is that there's less scrutiny about the setup and the support structure around students, because you don't have a funding council around it that's saying this is what you should be doing. So it feels like there's a double penalty, that A, you're not being paid, and B, you're not being supported by a wider structure often. So I would find it very difficult to ever accept a self-funded student to come and work with me, because I would find it hard to justify that to myself morally, that they were having to pay to study rather than being paid to do this work. And I think the second element of it is to think about, I'd urge all PhD students, prospective PhD students, to think really, really seriously about your supervisor. There are far too many horror stories out there, and just because they are the best name in the field does not mean they're going to be the best supervisor out there. You might think, wow, it's amazing, this huge person in this field wants me to come and work in their team, and isn't that fantastic? And won't that be great for my career? But I was much a part of making a decision in going into the PhD as being selected. So you need to be thinking about interviewing your prospective supervisor. Are they going to provide the support that I need? Are they going to have the right framework and the right mentality to support me through my PhD? Are they actually sensible human beings? Do they have some social skills? Do they care? Do they have empathy? Are they going to relate to me if I'm struggling? All of these things really matter. And I think far too often PhD students are only really realizing that when they've started the PhD, by which stage it feels too late, that they're stuck in a setup where they're working with somebody that's not supportive.
Yeah, I love that you flipped that script, because we often think that we are being interviewed and we are the ones being selected by the supervisor or by the university. But you're saying that we should be interviewing them to see if they have the right setup for us.
I was so lucky starting out on my PhD journey that I had a wonderful mentor as an undergraduate, who drew me up a list and said, you can go and work with this person, this person, and this person. I will never speak to you again if you go and work with this one, this one, and this one. That will be a very bad idea. Don't do it. But it was really helpful to get from someone that knew the field a really honest opinion of going, yeah, this person's work might not fit with yours so neatly, but they are a really nice person and they will look after you and you'll have a good experience doing that. So go there, don't go here. And if you can find someone that can help you get that inside view, that would be really useful.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, thank you so much, Nicola. We could go on, for another hour, I think, because there are so many things that I would love to ask you more about. But before we close, I do want to ask you, is there one thing that you would like the viewers or listeners to take away from this episode? If there was one thing that you would like people to leave this with, what would that be?
Oh, we'd be back on that whole university bit, to remember that there isn't really such a thing as the university. It is a collection of many, many individuals, and we all play our part in that. So if we want a whole university approach to mental health, it requires everybody working in it and studying in it to think about what bit am I doing to make this a better place for everybody's mental health. So anyone watching this that's working in higher education or studying there, the question to ask yourself is what bit can you do? What part can you play in improving the mental health for everybody?
Perfect. And again, before we close, I also want to ask if anybody wants to reach out to Smarten Our Student Minds, if they want to learn more about it, how can they do that?
Oh, easiest if you can share some web links with this, but it's smarten.org.uk and it's studentminds.org.uk.
Perfect.
I think these days you just have to Google it, right?
Yeah. But yeah, they do have an online presence, I guess, with just like every other initiative does. But I would like to thank you again so much for your insights, and I've learned so much from you, and this has been a lovely conversation.
Thank you, Hande. It's been great chatting. It's really, really nice to be able to have the time. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And for anyone listening or watching us, we're going to be back with another episode on well-being in higher education with another facet and with another amazing speaker. And thank you so much for being with us.